This is East Asia Tonight.
Good evening, I'm Telly Edwards. Tonight's top stories from East Asia. North Korean leader Kim Jong-un has ratified a mutual defense pact with Russia. The deal signed in June has already elevated their military ties, putting neighboring nations on edge. Now, the top China-hawk in the U.S. Senate might soon be in charge of Washington's foreign policy. Reports are suggesting that Donald Trump is eyeing Marco Rubio to be his Secretary of State. Now, we look at what this means for East Asia. The UN Secretary General tells the COP29 climate change conference that time is running out for humanity. Antonio Guterres says that the poor have been paying the highest price for the climate problems caused by the rich. And SoftBank posts a bumper second quarter, returning to profitability, all thanks to a string of Indian IPOs and investment gains at its tech-driven Vision Fund. And ahead on East Asia Tonight, China showcases its civil and military aerospace sector at the Zhuhai Air Show, where the new domestically produced stealth fighter jet is set to make its debut. Well, months of deepening military bonds between Moscow and Pyongyang have now been formalized after North Korean leader Kim Jong-un ratified a landmark mutual defense treaty with Russia. Well, Russian President Vladimir Putin signed the deal into law last week, and the two leaders struck the deal back in June. It calls for each side to come to the other's aid in case of an armed attack and cooperate against Western sanctions. But even before the ratification, international concern centered on Pyongyang possibly sending troops to help Moscow's war in Ukraine. Intelligence reports from South Korea, the U.S. and Ukraine say there are more than 10,000 North Korean soldiers in Russia. Some are believed to have engaged in combat in Kursk near the Ukraine border. Well, reports suggest the Russian military is preparing to reclaim Kursk using a force of 50,000 Russian and North Korean troops. Well, over in the U.S., reports say Donald Trump will tap Marco Rubio to be America's next top diplomat. The Florida senator is a foreign policy hawk, taking hard lines on China and Iran. So, if confirmed, what does this mean for relations with East Asia? Well, the 53-year-old has a long history of pushing tough trade action against Beijing, and these include restrictions on selling advanced tech to Chinese firms. In 2019, Mr. Rubio called for a national security review of Chinese social media app, TikTok, leading to the divestment order. And in September, Mr. Rubio's office published a report calling China the most powerful adversary the U.S. has faced in living memory. And he's also critical of China's human rights record, sponsoring a bill that bans Chinese imports of goods made using alleged forced labor by the ethnic Uyghur minority. And in 2020, Beijing sanctioned Mr. Rubio over his stance on Hong Kong following democracy protests. Mr. Rubio is also a Taiwan supporter, calling the island, quote, an independent democracy and introducing legislation to strengthen ties. But Marco Rubio may not be alone. President-elect Trump is said to have chosen another China critic to be his national security advisor. Republican Representative Mike Waltz was a colonel in the National Guard, and he wrote in a book that America faces an existential struggle against the Chinese Communist Party. Mr. Waltz has a five-part strategy that he says would prevent war with China. And these include arming Taiwan faster, reassuring allies in the Pacific, and modernizing planes and ships. For more insights into this, we are joined now by Dr. Ellen Kim. She's a senior fellow with a career chair at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and she is speaking to us from Seoul. Well, thanks, Dr. Kim, for joining us on East Asia tonight. I just want to pick up on that news we just announced where Trump is reportedly eyeing two Florida Republicans with hardline foreign policy views. So, Dr. Kim, I'm wondering, what are your thoughts on this? How do you think this could possibly shape East Asia's security dynamics, and how would this impact East Asia's allies?
Sure. I think that it clearly sends a signal that Trump administration's foreign policy focus will be on China. These two people that Trump selected has a hawkish view on China, as you explained. So I think that a lot of things will be focused on China during his as soon as his second term starts.
So, Dr. Kim, I'm going to move on to Kim Jong-un now. It looks like he has become more emboldened. He's become more assertive. How do you think Trump would handle this version of Kim Jong-un? And do you think we could see possibly another round of personal diplomacy to tackle ongoing tensions?
So during his campaign, President-elect Trump repeatedly emphasized his friendship with the North Korean leader. However, he never indicated whether he will resume a summit diplomacy with Kim Jong-un or how he will approach North Korean issues. So things are not clear at this point. Having said that, even if Donald Trump wanted to resume the summit diplomacy, the North Korean leader may not be interested in meeting Trump at this point because he's getting a lot of things that he needs from Russia. If the end of the Ukraine war affects any dynamics in the Russia-North Korea cooperation, I think that's when North Korean leader might want to start engage Donald Trump.
Well, in the meantime, the Biden administration, I mean, they still have a couple of months in the Oval Office. How do you think they are going to deal with this current situation of Pyongyang's investment in the Russia-Ukraine war?
So I don't think that there's a lot the Biden administration can do at this point other than sending the military aid. Sanctions have not been working, having little impacts on North Korea. Any interdictions of the arms trade between North Korea and Russia is risky and could lead to a dangerous arms conflict. So to effectively deal with the North Korea, particularly in its involvement in the Ukraine war, I think the first step should be the end of the Ukraine war, which could have an effect on the North Korea-Russia relations.
Well, speaking of that's kind of what Trump, he spoke about ending the war within 24 hours. A lot of people will say rhetoric. Is that what you would think, that this is basically an unrealistic scenario, even with Trump entering office in January?
So Trump and his team have not really revealed a detailed plan about how they are going to end the war. So it's a little too early to tell. But the key is how to bring the Russia and Ukraine to the negotiation table. Coming up with the terms that will satisfy both sides is not going to be easy, especially for Ukraine, because it has lost nearly 20% of territory since the beginning of the war. So this is going to be a huge task for the Trump administration from the start of his second term.
What about China, though? I mean, sort of like, at the start of this war, they were a little bit more involved, and now they seem more hands-off. Do you think China here has a part in terms of trying to bring Russia and Ukraine to the negotiating table?
I mean, China has publicly stated that they wanted to stabilize the situation, although U.S. has criticized China for its silently supporting Russia in its war in Ukraine. So, but once the Trump inaugurated, I think that China might quietly come to help stabilize the situation in the Ukraine.
And also, when Trump returns to the office, do you think South Korea would see the biggest impact in East Asia? Because he has criticized South Korea's leadership in the past. He's even threatened to blow up the alliance. So what are the stakes now?
Yes. So Trump's re-election have a huge implication for South Korea. As you mentioned, Trump has indicated many times that South Korea is a freeloader in security and also relying has a huge not doing on its job on the trade. Particularly, South Korea has a huge increasing trade surplus with the United States, which China. And even if during the Trump administration, Trump actually renegotiated the U.S.-ROK free trade agreement, but since then, even so, the U.S. and South Korea trade surplus has been growing. So I think that these both trade and defense issues gonna come up to the negotiation table when the Trump administration take into power. And another concern that South Korea might have is the defense cost sharing issue. Recently, Biden administration and the Yoon Suk-yeol government concluded their negotiations about how South Korea is going to cost share its defense for the U.S. troops on the Korean Peninsula. But once Trump comes to the White House, I think there's a high probability that he might want to renegotiate this deal.
All right. Tariffs, tough talks, tensions, that's going to be on the cards when Trump takes the office, especially with China. Would you say, Dr. Kim, that Beijing is better prepared for a second Trump presidency after that first trade war in 2018?
Yes, I think that Beijing seems much more prepared. Given its experience with the first Trump administration and Biden administrations, Chinese people seems to believe that U.S. policy toward China is not going to change, regardless of who becomes the president in the U.S. So in the past several years, China has begun diversifying its trade partners and supply chain to minimize its vulnerability. At the same time, Beijing has been preparing tools to have leverage against the United States. So I think that China is much more prepared than many people think.
Many thanks for your insights. We enjoyed that conversation. Dr. Ellen Kim, Senior Fellow, Career Chair at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Next, Indonesia's newly inaugurated leader, Prabowo Subianto, is in Washington today for his first meeting with his U.S. counterpart, Joe Biden. It is Mr. Prabowo's first trip there as president, and talks are set to focus on food security, clean energy, and strengthening people-to-people ties, as well as regional geopolitics. It's also Mr. Prabowo's recent state visit to China, where he met with President Xi Jinping and other leaders. He had emphasized that his country is non-aligned and respectful of all world powers. Charlie Vatvani in Jakarta tells us that among the many issues, how the potential policies of President-elect Donald Trump will likely come up in the discussions scheduled to be held in Washington. According to a written statement by the White House Secretary, President Biden and President Subianto indeed are scheduled to have a bilateral meeting, and the two leaders will explore ways to strengthen U.S.-Indonesian cooperation as part of the comprehensive strategic partnership. Now, the leaders are scheduled to coordinate on sustainable approaches on a number of issues, and that's including food security, clean energy transition, regional peace and stability, democracy and pluralism, and disaster relief, among other things. So we are expecting to see perhaps a number of agreements crop up in those issues. And Indonesia's Secretary of the Coordinating Ministry of Economic Affairs, meanwhile, has stated that one of the many things President Prabowo's visit to Washington, D.C. is aimed at is discussing potential policies that may be adopted by the U.S. President-elect Donald Trump. Now, one of these policies is the imposition of import tariffs on all Chinese products. So we are certainly going to be watching these developments very closely in all of these discussions as well. A top-ranking Russian official says the key task for Moscow and Beijing is to contain what he calls the U.S. policy of dual containment. Sergei Shoigu, the Kremlin's Secretary of the Security Council, made those comments during his meeting with China's top diplomat Wang Yi in Beijing today. Now, he was repeating a statement previously made by Presidents Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin in May. Back then, the two leaders signed a joint statement criticizing the U.S. for its policy of dual containment against China and Russia. And they also pledged to strengthen coordination and cooperation as a response. The ministry has said Mr. Shoigu's visit is for the 19th China-Russia Strategic Security Consultation, as well as the 9th Law Enforcement and Security Cooperation Mechanism. Mr. Shoigu will also attend Air Show China, where one of the Kremlin's stealth fighters will be showcased. And that's right, China's largest air show kicked off in Zhuhai today, showcasing its civil and military aerospace capabilities to potential customers and rivals alike. And one of the biggest highlights this year is the official debut of a new stealth fighter jet. And we're talking about the J-35A stealth aircraft that has taken more than a decade to develop. The J-35A is lighter than China's existing model, the J-20, and looks similar in design to a U.S. F-35. Experts believe the showcase means the J-35A is nearly ready to enter operation. And this will make China the only country other than the U.S. to have two stealth fighters in action. China has been pouring more resources into modernizing and expanding its air defense capabilities against many geopolitical flashpoints, including Taiwan and the South China Sea. Right, time now for a short break, but coming up next on East Asia tonight, Japan announces more than $65 billion of fresh support for the nation's semiconductor and AI sector. Plus, Chinese retailers wrap up their supersized Singles Day event, but leave investors guessing with no word yet on sales specifics. Hello again. You are just in time for the business update with Roland Lim. And Roland, we're hearing about SoftBank surprising markets yet again with its second quarter earnings. Tell us more.
Right, you are. I'll tell you, SoftBank's bets on AI and other volatile tech innovations have made for a roller coaster earnings season. And the global boom in those sectors has helped SoftBank to swing back into profit in the second quarter. The tech giant benefited from higher share prices of listed companies in its Vision Fund investment vehicles. Net profit in the 3 months to September came in at $7.7 billion. That soundly beat expectations of $1.87 billion profit and stands in stark contrast with a net loss of some $6 billion just a year ago. The results show SoftBank's more cautious approach to investment is bearing some fruit. CEO Masayoshi Son's investing juggernaut was forced into a prolonged period of retrenchment. That's as interest rate hikes caused the value of its holdings in high-growth tech startups to crater. Now, some of these valuations are beginning to recover, pushing the Vision Fund unit to an investment gain of around $4 billion. The principal contributors this quarter were Chinese ride-hailing giant Didi, as well as South Korean e-commerce company Coupang. They drove an investment gain in Vision Fund 1 to $5.7 billion. IPOs in India also lifted valuations by $1.7 billion. Meantime, its stock ending the trading day about 1% in the red. And Nissan Motor shares jumped as much as almost 21%, or 12% today, I should say, 12.81%, before trimming some of those losses to close at around 13%. The surprise boost coming in from the news that activist investor Effissimo Capital Management, or ECM, had taken a stake in the struggling Japanese automaker. In a regulatory filing, Nissan disclosed Cayman Island-registered ECM Master Fund as a shareholder of a 2.5% stake as at the end of September. Now, shareholder activism has gained traction in Japan, where international and domestic investors are demanding firms to improve corporate governance and capital allocation at a record pace. Nissan last week announced plans to cut some 9,000 jobs and 20% of its global manufacturing capacity amid a sales slump in China and the US, slashing its annual profit outlook by some 70%. Japanese Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba has pledged more than $65 billion of fresh support for the country's semiconductor and artificial intelligence sector. This as Tokyo looks to keep up with a global spending spree on cutting-edge tech. Now, Mr. Ishiba expressed hope that the $65 billion support for the sector by 2030 would help generate public and private investments of more than $325 billion over the next 10 years. The Japanese government is looking to submit the plan to the next parliament session. It reportedly includes bills to support the mass production of next-generation chips. The new funding framework is expected to create an economic impact of around $1 trillion. It also looks to tap on various suppliers of chips, specifically state-backed Rapidus, which plans to start mass manufacturing of next-generation chips in 2027. Under the new framework, the government will support the company's fundraising efforts on various fronts. The Japanese semiconductor industry has received about some $26 billion in funding in recent years. Still, further support is the need of the hour, as the additional funding is aimed at helping Japan narrow the gap with global powers on chip support. Australia is planning measures to keep its banks in the Pacific Islands amid concerns that China could strengthen its presence there by filling in the gaps left behind. Australian Treasurer Jim Chalmers announced that the government was in the final stages of negotiations to keep ANZ Bank open in key Pacific Island nations, including Fiji, Vanuatu, Solomon Islands, and Papua New Guinea. ANZ Bank confirmed that discussions were ongoing, but it was not clear whether the government would subsidize its Pacific operations. Many Western banks have shuttered branches in the Pacific due to political turmoil, thin profits, and high costs of doing business. State-owned Bank of China has signaled its interest in stepping in. The firm is in the final stages of opening its first branch in Papua New Guinea's capital, Port Moresby. The Bank of China has also signed a memorandum of understanding with Pacific microstate Nauru, which severed diplomatic ties with Taiwan in favor of Beijing earlier this year. Australia's Bendigo Bank, the only foreign operating on the island, has said it will be closing its Nauru office by the middle of next year. The world's biggest online shopping event, China's Singles Day, wrapped up at midnight on Monday. Investors had been looking at the shopping event for clues on whether Beijing's efforts to boost consumption are working. China's largest e-commerce company, Alibaba, said it recorded, quote, robust growth in sales and record number of shoppers, but it did not release total sales revenue for the period. China's second biggest e-commerce company, JD.com, also choosing to stay quiet, so no specific information about sales, but reported a more than 20% year-on-year increase in shoppers over the event. Data provider Sinton estimates that sales across major e-commerce platforms rose more than 26% to $199 billion over the Singles Day event. The festival is viewed as a gauge of consumer confidence. Expectations for sales growth were subdued this year as confidence in the world's second-largest economy remains low in the wake of a prolonged property crunch and macroeconomic slowdown. China is looking to make more concerted efforts to shore up demand in its sluggish property sector. It is reportedly preparing to reduce taxes on home purchases, dialing up fiscal support to revive the ailing sector. Bloomberg reports a proposal is in the works which would allow megacities, including Shanghai and Beijing, to cut the deed tax for buyers, be reduced as low as 1% from the current level of 3%. Top-tier cities are also expected to be allowed to scrap the distinction between ordinary and luxury homes. Now, experts say it would substantially lower purchasing costs for people seeking to upgrade their residences. China is, in the past 2 months, have unleashed its strongest package of policies to boost the property market, including cutting borrowing costs on existing mortgages and relaxing buying curbs in big cities and easing down payment requirements. Following that, residential property sales rose for the first time this year in October, suggesting that efforts are beginning to bear fruit. But analysts say the recovery is lopsided, with state developers benefiting the most from the stimulus and buyers preferring existing homes instead of new ones. Greater China markets sank today over disappointment on Beijing's lack of measures to boost its stuttering economy and souring U.S.-China trade with the return of Trump. Hong Kong's Hang Seng Index closing below 20,000 for the first time since Beijing's stimulus was announced in late September, giving up all its stimulus gains since then. The onshore renminbi also trading lower against the greenback. It's currently trading down by 0.28%, 7234 to the dollar. Now, China has fixed the renminbi at its weakest level in more than a year. The People's Bank of China set its daily fix for the currency at 7.19 to the dollar. That's up 0.2% over yesterday. Disappointment over the fiscal stimulus and threat of higher tariffs added to the yuan's slide. And those Trump fears also hitting South Korean chip makers, both Samsung Electronics and SK Hynix, ending lower. Samsung shares now at its lowest level in more than 2 years. Investors are worried that Trump may try to reduce the $52 billion worth of grants to chip makers given to entice them to open up plants in the U.S. And that is the latest in business. Otele.
Thanks so very much, Roland. Well, coming up next on East Asia Tonight, UN Chief Antonio Guterres issues a dire warning about the fight to limit global warming. We'll be speaking to CNA's Jack Board after this break. Heat waves, typhoons and rising disasters. Asia faces the harsh reality of climate change. Can urgent action save lives before it's too late? North Korea ratifies a mutual defense treaty with Russia, signed by the two countries' leaders in June. The pact calls for each side to come to the other's aid in case of an armed attack. U.S. President-elect Donald Trump has reportedly chosen vocal China critics for key roles in his cabinet. He is expected to tap Florida Senator Marco Rubio as Secretary of State and Representative Mike Waltz as National Security Advisor. UN Chief Antonio Guterres tells world leaders at the COP29 summit to pay up to prevent climate-led humanitarian disasters, warning that time is running out to limit a destructive rise in global temperatures. The host of the UN Climate Summit in Azerbaijan has delivered a surprising opening address. President Ilham Aliyev defended fossil fuels, which are blamed for warming the planet, and said that countries have a right to exploit them.
It's a gift of the God. Every natural resource, whether it's oil, gas, wind, sun, gold, silver, copper, all that are natural resources. And countries should not be blamed for having them and should not be blamed for bringing these resources to the market, because the market needs them. The people need them.
This year's summit is focused on boosting funding for developing countries to deal with the effects of climate change. UN Chief Antonio Guterres told the few world leaders gathered at the summit to reach a deal that does not leave poorer countries empty-handed. Now, he warns that time is running out to limit a destructive rise in global temperatures. Mr. Guterres stressed that the clean energy revolution is here to stay, calling countries who are doubling down on fossil fuels absurd. And for more, we are joined now by CNA's climate change correspondent, Jack Board, live in Baku. Jack, let's just pick up on what was mentioned by UN Chief Antonio Guterres on fossil fuels. What can we make of his stance on this year's goal of climate finance?
Yeah, it was really a speech in stark contrast to what we heard from the Azerbaijan president. I think the headline moment from Antonio Guterres' speech to world leaders was that 2024 has been a masterclass in climate disasters. So it was a speech that we have grown accustomed to hearing from the UN chief over the past few years, full of colourful language. And it was a speech really focused on the impacts, the threats, and the finances. COP29 is, sharply focusing on climate finance, and there's hope from the UN as well as from the COP presidency that potentially trillions of dollars, if not hundreds of billions of dollars, can be mobilized here in Azerbaijan, especially for developing countries who are experiencing the worst impacts of climate change. It was also interesting that Antonio Guterres made mention of some of the inequalities that are flowing through these climate financial mechanisms. He made note that only 15% of new clean energy investments are actually going to developing or emerging economies outside of China. He said that, simply the world has to pay up or humanity will pay the price. Take a listen to a little bit of his fiery speech here at COP29.
There is no time to lose. On climate finance, the world must pay up or humanity will pay the price. Excellencies, in this crucial period, you and your governments must be guided by a clear truth. Climate finance is not charity, it's an investment. Climate action is not optional, it's an imperative. Both are indispensable to a livable world for all humanity and a prosperous future for every nation on earth. The clock is ticking.
Yeah, no doubt a fiery speech there from Guterres. Now, Jack, as U.S. participation falters, we don't know what Trump is going to do when he enters the White House in January. All eyes now are on China possibly being able to fill in the void. What do you think could be the likely contribution from the world's largest greenhouse gas emitter?
I think there are very interesting contrasts emerging from both Washington and Beijing around this summit. Now, last week we heard from China's foreign ministry, who reaffirmed China's stance and involvement in these UN climate processes, to be part of the UNFCCC, to be part of the Paris Agreement, to be part of the climate finance goals here in Baku. And that's in sharp contrast to what we're hearing from, re-elected US President Donald Trump, who is in all likelihood going to withdraw the United States from the Paris Agreement and potentially from the UN framework on climate change. Right now, China's targets are to reach peak emissions by 2030 and to reach carbon net zero by 2060. Of course, it is the dominant force in a lot of these clean technologies that are being discussed here at COP, whether it be solar panels, EVs, batteries, wind turbines. China is central to all of these discussions, yet also facing trade headwinds that could see some of those technologies spread all around the world. Donald Trump could potentially make that situation even more difficult going forward. And we've heard from US climate envoy John Podesta here in Baku. He's still putting pressure on Beijing to come to the table here with improved goals, economy-wide climate targets that align properly with the Paris Agreement and the 1.5-degree goal. And China as well also facing calls to become a donor country, to start contributing to some of these climate financing funds, which historically it has not been willing to do and still considers itself a developing nation. So I think plenty of eyes on China's contingent here in Baku to see whether they can emerge as a real leader in this space, given that we're likely to see the US withdrawing as a dominant force in the space.
Well, thanks so very much for that report. CNA's climate change correspondent Jack Board live from Baku in Azerbaijan. The news, Singapore pledges to match every dollar up to 500 million USD for green and transition projects in Asia. Well, this contributes to an existing initiative by the central bank to gather up to $5 billion to make climate action less financially risky. Now, such funds will be from sources such as philanthropists and development banks.
As a financial hub, Singapore is doubling our efforts to mobilize financing to support the global climate action. This combined pool of concessional capital will be used to crowd in commercial capital and other sources of finance to accelerate capital flows to support Asia's green transition.
The announcement was made at the opening of the Singapore Pavilion and the 29th UN Climate Change Conference in Azerbaijan. Ms. Fu added that Singapore has also made good progress on its climate ambition so far, such as increasing solar energy, greening buildings and raising energy imports. A COP29 caps a year of deadly weather events, especially here in this region. South Asia went from extreme heat to heavy flooding in a matter of months. And Southeast Asia is still reeling from one of its deadliest typhoons in more than a decade. Well, experts are saying that it's a clear sign of worse things to come as global warming intensifies. Li Ling Tan reports from Singapore.
March was when the mercury started rising dramatically across India, topping 50 degrees Celsius in some parts of the country. By June, there were more than 40,000 suspected heat stroke cases. By September, an estimate of more than 700 people had died.
We had the most extended period of heat wave.
And signs are pointing to more of those ahead. It's got public policy expert Chandra Bhushan working on solutions to improve disaster response and help people adapt.
We need to protect ourselves from extreme heat wave. But on the other hand, we also need to start talking about providing sustainable cooling solutions, which is affordable to everyone, even the poor.
He says India needs about $1.2 trillion this decade to adapt to climate change, but it must also green the economy and reduce emissions in 25 years.
There will be some investment that will be required, but the situation where the temperature will become so high that it will be unbearable for humans to survive, it will be impossible for humans to survive, will only happen if we continue emitting greenhouse gases at the rate we are doing today.
And it might not take much to tip that scale. Associate Professor Jason Lee is a well-known authority on the impact of heat on health and productivity. He says we don't need a 5 or 10 degree jump in temperature for things to go very badly. We're already almost there.
The best analogy would be when you have a full cup, another drip can tip and overflow the cup. Or a small snowball can trigger an avalanche. So we are near that threshold, so we don't need to have huge magnitude of change. Incremental small change could potentially induce irreversible damages.
The United Nations says Asia has been warming at a faster rate than the global average, and the trend is likely to continue, meaning more intense heat waves ahead. But there's hope.
We don't need groundbreaking findings to save lives. There are solutions that have been proven to reduce heat strain. We just need to adapt and apply correctly. Having said that, with modern technologies, artificial intelligence, data science, wearables, right, it is our aspiration to harness on those to pick up the last men or women who are under heat stress. Because heat stress or succumbing to heat stress is totally preventable, and no one should die of extreme heat.
There are other extremes as well. Scientists say climate change is leading to more floods, typhoons and landslides, costing lives and crippling economies in what is already the world's worst disaster-affected region. Just this past September, Typhoon Yagi tore through the region, leaving more than 840 people dead and $16.5 billion in damages. Vietnam was hit especially hard. Dr. Mai Trong Nguyen, Vice Chairman of the Vietnam Policy Advisory Council on Climate Change, worries that the impact will only get worse.
Biến đổi khí hậu các cái hiện tượng cực đoan như đã nói ở phần trước, đó là tăng lên cả về tần suất, cả về cường độ. Và đặc biệt là tăng cái tính bất định, tính đoán định rất khó. Cường độ và mức độ tác động nó vượt cái khả năng chống chịu tự nhiên. Và đặc biệt là vượt cả khả năng chống chịu xã hội, bao gồm cả nền kinh tế, cơ sở hạ tầng và năng lực của người dân.
The outlook is gloomy. Climate change is expected to influence the approaching El Niño weather system, and that could bring wetter than normal conditions to a region that's already bracing for the year-end northeast monsoon season. It's a reminder of what's at stake for countries here on the front lines of the climate battle, whose fates now lie in the hands of negotiators and decision makers in Azerbaijan. Li Ling Tan, CNA, Singapore.
Well, 2 years after catastrophic floods devastated Pakistan, millions of homes remain in ruins. While the government works to build climate-resistant homes, progress is slow due to funding delays and rising costs. Well, in the second of our three-part special, Hira Mustafa takes us to Bardin district, where survivors are still grappling with the aftermath of the disaster and the threat of future floods.
80-year-old Resham Bibi is one of many flood survivors in Badin, living in constant fear of her mud house crumbling in the next heavy downpour. As this year's monsoon rains recede and with winter drawing near, she is hurrying to repair her dilapidated home. Every 2 weeks, Resham Bibi dives into a pond to collect mud, which she mixes with straw to plaster and patch her walls in the hopes of prolonging the life of her house.
Two years on, Pakistan's flood-ravaged regions are still reeling. The trauma of the disaster lingers, replaced by a gnawing fear of what the future holds. Climate anxiety has become a daily reality for many of these residents.
The devastation of 2022 and heavy monsoon rains the following year plunged already impoverished communities further into financial ruin. 45% of Sindh's population already live below the poverty line. Government estimates suggest that poverty rates in this region increased by as much as 10% after the 2022 disaster.
So there were many existing challenges and inequities faced by communities, especially in flood-prone areas in southern Sindh. So of course, those kind of issues are very hard to fix in the short term, especially when we don't have the required funds. A lot of the funding that was pledged to Pakistan by countries overseas in response to the floods in 2022 was not in fact aid, but they were loans that were provided that have to be repaid by the government.
UNICEF, along with the Sindh government and the World Bank, is working to address one of the most urgent challenges, the need for sturdy, flood-resistant homes. They're giving grants of some $1,000 to 2.1 million households in the province to help them build new homes, not with traditional mud and wood, but concrete and bricks made from recycled plastic. One recipient in Bedin is Nawab Khan, whose family lost everything in the disaster.
बड़ी सैलाब आई थी बड़े बड़े फिर हमको मजबूरी के लिए घर भी छोड़ने पड़ गए घर तो हमारे गिर गए थे हमारे घर भर ये सारे गिर गए ख़त्म हो गए फिर हम घर से बाहर निकल गए कहीं सड़कों पर कहीं रोडों पर कहीं स्कूलों में गए उन तंबों में 2 महीना 4 महीना 6 महीना गुजारा किया फिर हुकूमत की तरफ से एक स्कीम आया बोला वो हुकूमत घर बना कर दे रहे हैं और पहला किस्त आया 75,000 का दूसरा किस्त आया 1 लाख रुपए का.
To preserve the limited funds solely for construction materials, Nawab is building the house himself. The new homes are sited on elevated ground with foundations of stones and bricks, which the local government is supplying. So far, 300,000 of these climate-resistant homes have been completed, while 500,000 are still under construction.
The houses which we've made are not only helping the people who have been affected, but they're based on energy, solar-based houses. The houses we've built are flood-resistant, climate-resistant, and also green.
Yet many in Bedin say they are frustrated by delays in receiving government aid. The rising costs of construction material is also forcing them to dip into their own meager savings.
हमारी सिर्फ यही रिक्वेस्ट है इन लोगों से गवर्नमेंट से जो भी कुछ है इन लोगों से तो भाई जो हमें पैसे जो है जल्दी जल्दी दें तो हम अपना घर जल्दी जल्दी बनाएं इन लकड़ियों के घर से हम जान छोड़ाएं.
We have some issues going on with the federal government. We feel that a lot of funds which were supposed to come to us haven't been released timely. So that does have a trickle-down effect.
Nawab Khan and those with new homes are the lucky few in Bedin. For Resham Bibi and countless others in flood-ravaged communities, the prospect of having their lives swept away once more looms large. They are calling on the government to urgently ramp up rebuilding efforts before the next disaster strikes. Hira Mustafa, CNA, in Bedin, Sindh Province.
Thousands in the Philippines are still in shelters after Typhoon Toraji lashed parts of the country yesterday. Well, the storm was the fourth major one to hit the country in less than a month. Toraji struck northeast of Manila before moving out into the South China Sea, weakening further as it approaches Hong Kong. And at the same time, officials are now observing the path of Tropical Storm Usagi, which is now strengthening and just 2 days away from the coast of Luzon. Well, this video here was filmed when Toraji made landfall in the Philippines, where winds in excess of 130 kilometers per hour were recorded. The torrential rain and gusty swells felled trees and damaged the roofs of houses and structures. And there have been no reports of casualties, though officials are still assessing the damage. Coming up next on East Asia Tonight, Japan's Prime Minister has been re-elected by Parliament for the top job. When we come back, we look at the challenges he will face as the head of a minority government. Japan's Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba has vowed to transform the ruling Liberal Democratic Party after winning a runoff vote in Parliament to stay in the top job. Well, he has reappointed almost all of his previous cabinet, except for 3 new ministers for transport, justice and agriculture. Well, CNA's Michio Ishida tells us the challenges facing Mr. Ishiba in leading a new minority government.
Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba opened his media conference by comparing the time his Liberal Democratic Party lost the government in 2009 with the outcome of the latest general election. The ruling coalition lost its majority amid a slush fund scandal that came to light late last year, leading to public distrust of the party.
それから12年が経ちました。私は今一度この思いに立ち返らなければならない。と思っておるところであります。今般の実に厳しい選挙の結果を受けまして、我々自由民主党は今度こそあるべき国民政党として 生まれ変わらなければならないと考えております。
In response, Mr. Ishiba said banning the use of non-taxable funds for political activities is an option, promising to set up a third-party monitoring mechanism. He said another option is creating a public accessible database on political donations, which he hopes to pass into law by the end of the year. As Mr. Ishiba prepares to lead a minority government, he will need support from opposition parties to pass his policy agenda. Mr. Ishiba said he will deepen discussion and try to reach common ground. As to his key agenda, he named economic revitalization, disaster management, and Japan's severe security situation, pointing out China and Russia's intrusions into Japanese territory and military drills, North Korea's missiles, as well as the participation of North Korean troops in Russia's invasion of Ukraine. He plans to leave on Thursday for South America to attend the APEC and G20 summit and possibly meet U.S. President Joe Biden and South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol. He also hopes to have a face-to-face meeting with U.S. President-elect Donald Trump as soon as possible. Michio Ishida, CNA, Tokyo.
Oh, we also spoke with Tomohiko Taniguchi, Special Advisor at the Fujitsu Future Studies Center, and he explained how Prime Minister Ishiba is likely to act on his promise for reform.
He has spent a lot of time describing what should be done to reform Japanese political funding arrangement, political funding scheme. And it's going to be something that's going to be discussed and debated together with his opposition party colleagues. Now he has to call opposition party colleagues because nothing can be achievable without involving some of those opposition parties. So the political funding reform is the first step that he's going to sell to the opposition party to form an ad hoc coalition. Speaking of which, everything must be an ad hoc coalition because the LDP and its coalition partner Komeito, the quasi-religious party, have lost the majority. First, second, third, most important thing is to boost public support for the LDP and the coalition partner Komeito, because July next year there will be another important election, this time for the House of Councillors, that is to say, the upper house. Unlike in some other countries like the UK or India, the upper house in Japan does have a very strong veto power. In the event that the LDP is going to have to lose the majority there as well, there is going to be a huge paralysis. So the next several months will be very much crucial for Ishiba to gain support and to gain trust once again from the public. And everything else is secondary.
And that does it for East Asia tonight. Don't forget your headlines anytime at cna.asia. Thanks for watching.